Buenos dias, good morning. How is everybody today? Great. Sorry, I decided to upgrade this year and use a tablet instead of paper, so bear with me. Good morning, buenos dias. Thank you very much to Scott and to South by Southwest Eco for creating this amazing space and opportunity for us to come together. And thank you for all of you for coming out on this beautiful morning and to share in your work and in your stories as well. As was mentioned, my name is Kim Wasserman, and I am the Executive Director for the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization located on the southwest side of Chicago. We are an amazingly resistant community of 90,000 people, of which half of our population is under the age of 25. Not only are we a young community that is rich in culture, we are an amazingly strong economic corridor in Chicago. Our main street, which is known as 26th Street, comes in second behind Michigan Avenue in tax revenue, yet we have no big box stores in our neighborhood. While we have some strengths, our health and environment was not one of them. For almost 70 years, the Little Village community was home to one of the two top 10 dirtiest coal power plants in the country. The other top 10 ranking coal power plant was located in the neighborhood right next door to us of Pilsen, which was also a predominantly Mexican and Mexican-American community. And for over 10 years, our communities fought to shut them down. Just like South by Southwest Eco, our campaign was a collaborative effort that required an amazing community education component and organizing plan that ensured our communities not only understood the full death cycle of coal, but that our communities spoke for themselves as well. And that while we understood the need for coalition in this work, we needed to be clear with many of the big green organizations that had a history of just using us for photo opportunities and then co-opting our community work for funding, also known as poverty pimping. We needed to let these folks know that that would no longer be tolerated. In order for our collaborations to be transformative and strategic, it must be based on trust and understanding that we don't all start from the same place. That our history, our privilege, our race, our class, and our income all play into the work that we do, and the need for understanding what brings people to the table. In the case of our community, we work on the fundamental framework of both the Jemez principles and the environmental justice principles, whose goal is not to get us all to agree, but to understand what we stand for, how we move collectively, and most important, to be able to agree to disagree. I think last night in the debate, they could have used that. In the case of the Clean Power Coalition, which was the name of the coalition that we created, please understand that it took us 3 tries to get it right. And it was because we were working off of each other's strengths and not selling each other out and putting each other under the bus like in the past. When the key opportunity to make this campaign a central part of the Chicago mayoral election presented itself, we were able to launch an amazing campaign that was built on the strengths of partners like the Sierra Club, whose membership and electoral power were able to make this one of the top 3 issues of the election, and supported also the funding of a strong media campaign that included billboards and newspaper advertisements, something that our organization and our budget could never afford. Greenpeace and amazing local allies were able to host nonviolent direct actions throughout the years. That allowed for our community to have a strong organizing strategy and a strong narrative, along with an equitable budget that required the transparency of all organizations at the table with their grant funding. Throughout the campaign, we used diverse strategies which were rooted in community. From the Coal Olympics, when Chicago was vying for the Olympics, we hosted games that focused on the death cycle of coal. Teams won gold, silver, and bronze asthma inhalers at the completion of an obstacle course that included digging through mountains of coal to highlight mountaintop removal and the fallacy of clean coal. To taking community members on kayak trips along the Chicago Sanitation and Ship Canal to understand the water usage and discharge of the coal power plant. Around the coal power plants was the only part of the Chicago River and the Chicago Sanitation Canal that did not freeze in the winters of Chicago because of how hot the water was that they discharged, having lasting environmental impacts on our waterways. For the first time in 2012, our entire river system finally froze. For the first time in 2012. In 2012, the Clean Power Coalition was successful in pressuring Midwest Generation, the owners of the coal power plant, to close the Crawford and Fisk coal power plants in Chicago. This led to the work of the organization I work for and my role being awarded the Goldman Prize in 2013. The Goldman Prize allowed me the opportunity to join the ranks of amazing environmental advocates from across the world, and most notably, 2 amazing women in the fight against coal, the amazing Judy Bonds and Maria Gonneau. Ironically, our work had been brought together long before that. In 2002, LVJO was fortunate to meet Judy Bonds at the U.S. Social Forum and learned about mountaintop removal. The passion and fight for our communities led to the opportunity to take elders and youth from the holler of Appalachia to the hood of Little Village, hence starting from the holler to the hood, to see how coal was killing us and share in what a just transition could look like. We were not only able to share in our campaign tactics, but most importantly, learn about organizing techniques and deepen our commitment to intergenerational organizing that is culturally strong and rooted in community. These principles led not only to the closure of the plants, but the reinstatement of our local bus line in 2013, which was a 5-year campaign. And in 2014, we won our oldest campaign, the completion of a 23-acre park in our community that we fought for over 20 years for. Transit, open space are also components of environmental justice. But the reality is, from rural America to the inner cities of Chicago, it's not just our environment under attack. After years of inaction from our local government, now that we have fought and won clean air, better public transit, and more park space, our community looks ripe for gentrification and displacement. This is not environmental justice. While we win on the environment on one hand, on the other hand, our public schools, transit, parks, and services are starved to entice development and foster privatization. In Chicago, while the city looks to improve the Chicago River so it can become the next economic generator for the city, the development this spurred is not intended for low-income communities of color. This is why the city has now set its eyes on the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal and our communities that butt against it. So we are preparing. Will we be displaced in the name of resiliency? Or will these industrial jobs have a commitment to local hiring with union opportunities, but also a ladder of opportunity to temp positions, understanding the realities of many undocumented people in our community? Do they come with living wage jobs and local training opportunities, and not only meet the highest environmental standards, but invest in the local community as well? As an organization, we recognize that our work continues and we must fight to ensure that justice is across all sectors and not just the environment, that our public good is also an environmental justice issue. We are not only making the connections locally, but linking them with our organizing and training of the next generation of organizers that can take our principles and work across many spectrums. We recognize that voting is not the only action we should be taking once every 4 years, but that we need to be working in our communities every single day. This is not a model that only LVJO uses, but many innovative and thought-leading organizations like the Waterkeeper Alliance use. The Alliance has helped spawn over 270 Waterkeeper organizations across the globe. Our keynote speaker today serves as Senior Attorney and President for Waterkeeper Alliance and Chief Prosecuting Attorney for the Hudson River Keeper. A man whose reputation as a resolute defender of the environment stems from a litany of successful legal actions. Mr. Kennedy was one of Time Magazine's heroes for the planet for his successful helping riverkeepers lead the fight to restore the Hudson River. He is also a clinical professor and supervising attorney at Pace University School of Law's Environmental Litigation Clinic and is a co-host of Ring of Fire on Air America Radio. From assistant district attorney in New York City to working on environmental issues across the Americas, his work has encompassed successful negotiating treaties protecting traditional homelands of indigenous tribes in Latin America and Canada, to leading the fight to protect New York City's water supply, whose watershed agreement that he negotiated is regarded as an international model in stakeholder consensus, negotiations, and sustainable development. He is a graduate of Harvard University, University of Virginia Law School, and Pace University School of Law. From writing New York Times bestsellers to award-winning articles, he is also a licensed master falconer, which I learned, and continually pursues a lifelong enthusiasm for whitewater paddling. So it is a true honor and privilege to introduce this morning's keynote speaker. Please help me in welcoming Mr. Robert F. Kennedy, Jr.
Hey, Kim. Thanks.
You're welcome.
So thank you, Kim, and thank you all for having me here. Kim is one of my heroes. Please excuse my voice, which should get better as I speak. But I'm going to elaborate on some of the themes that Kimberly was talking about, and particularly the intersection between the environment and poverty and democracy. And I'm going to do it within the framework of talking about the Waterkeeper Alliance, which is the group that I serve as president. And the Waterkeeper Alliance is the umbrella group for several hundred waterkeepers now in, I think, 38 countries. This week, we passed an important milestone of licensing our 300th Waterkeeper. I just came back from a week in Peru, where we have 3 Waterkeepers that are fighting dam projects on 3 of the most important rivers in Latin America. A week before that, I was in the Himalayas in India, where we have 7 Waterkeepers protecting the major waterways that supply water to 40% of the people on the face of the earth. The headwaters of those of rivers like the Ganges and the Yangtze and the Yellow River and the Mekong and many other those rivers that supply the waterways of Asia. The first Waterkeeper was founded on the Hudson River in 1966 by a blue-collar coalition of commercial and recreational fishermen who mobilized to reclaim the Hudson River from its polluters. We have on the Hudson the oldest commercial fishery in North America. It's 350 years old. Many of the people I represent come from families that have been fishing the river continuously since Dutch colonial times. It's a traditional gear fishery. They use the same fishing methods that were taught by the Algonquin Indians to the original Dutch settlers of New Amsterdam and then passed down through the generations. One of the enclaves of the commercial fishery on the Hudson is a little village called Crotonville, New York, which is 30 miles north of New York City on the east bank of the river. And the people who lived in Crotonville in 1966 were not your prototypical kind of affluent environmentalists. They were factory workers and carpenters and lathers and electricians. Half the people in Crotonville made their living, or at least some part of it, crabbing or fishing the Hudson. These were people who had little expectation that they'd ever see Yosemite or Yellowstone or the Everglades of the national park. They didn't have the resources to take those kind of vacations. For them, as for most Americans, the environment was their backyard. It was the bathing beaches, the swimming holes, the fishing holes of the Hudson River. Richie Garrett, and it was their property values, that was their livelihood, it was their salaries, it was their recreation. Richie Garrett, who was the first president of the Hudson River Keeper, used to say about the Hudson, it's our Riviera, it's our Monte Carlo. Richie Garrett was a grave digger from Austining, New York. He used to tell his new followers, I'll be the last to let you down. In 1966, Penn Central Railroad began vomiting oil from a 4.5-foot pipe in the Croton-Harmon rail yard, and the oil went up the river on the tides, and it blackened the beaches, and made the shad taste of diesel, so they couldn't be sold at the Fulton Fish Market in New York City. And all the people in Crotonville came together in the only public building in the town, which was the American Legion Hall. It was a very patriotic community. Crotonville, New York had one of the highest mortality rates during World War II of any community in our country. Virtually the entire male population joined the Marines the day after Pearl Harbor. And almost all of the original founders and board members and officers at Riverkeeper were former Marines. They were combat veterans or their families. They were combat veterans from World War II or Korea. Richie Garrett was a Korean War vet. These weren't radicals, they weren't militants, they were people whose patriotism was rooted in the bedrock of our country. But that night they started talking about violence because they saw something that they thought they owned, which was the abundance of these fisheries that their parents had exploited for generations, and the purity of the Hudson's waters and the beaches, etc. And these things were being robbed from them by large corporate entities over whom they had no control. And they had been to the government agencies that are supposed to protect Americans from pollution, to the Corps of Engineers, the Coast Guard, the State Conservation Department, and they were given the bum's rush. After 20 visits by Richie Garrett and another Marine named Art Glauca, who was an airline pilot for Eastern Airlines at the time, who visited the Corps of Engineers office in Manhattan 20 times, begging the Corps colonel to do his job and shut down the Penn Central pipe. And finally, he told them in exasperation, these are important people. Speaking of the Penn Central Board of Directors, he said, we can't treat them that way. In other words, we can't force them to comply with the law. And by this evening in March of 1966, virtually everybody in Crotonville came together in a room about a third this size. Virtually, and there were 300 people there that evening. They stayed there till 1 o'clock in the morning. And everybody in that room had come to the conclusion that government was in cahoots with the polluters. And the only way that they were going to reclaim the river for themselves is if they confronted the polluters directly. And somebody suggested that they put a match to the oil slick coming out of the Penn Central pipe and burn up the pipe. Somebody else said they should roll a mattress up and jam it up the pipe and flood the rail yard with its own waste. Somebody else said that they should float a raft of dynamite into the intake of the Indian Point power plant, which at that time was killing 1 million fish a day on its intake screens and taking food off their family tables. And then a guy stood up whose name was Robert Boyle, and he was the outdoor editor of Sports Illustrated magazine. He was actually at Sports Illustrated for 65 years. He wrote about hunting and fishing. And he was a world famous fly fisherman. He was one of the gurus of dry fly tying in this country. He had written half a dozen books on angling. 2 years before, he had written an article about angling in the Hudson for Sports Illustrated. And in researching that article, he had come across an ancient navigational statute called the 1888 Rivers and Harbors Act. And that statute said that it was illegal to pollute any waterway in the United States. You had to pay a big penalty if you got caught, but also there was a bounty provision that said that anybody who turned in the polluter got to keep half the fine. And he had sent a copy of that law over to the libel lawyers at Time magazine, which owned Sports Illustrated, and he knew from earlier transactions. And he said to them, "This is still good law." They sent him a memo back saying, in 80 years, it has never been enforced, but it's still on the books and it's still good law. And that evening, when all these men and women were talking about violence, he stood up in front of them with a copy of the law and a copy of the memo from the attorneys. And he said, "We shouldn't be talking about breaking the law. We should be talking about enforcing it." And they resolved that evening that they were going to start a group that was then called the Hudson River Fishermen's Association, later became Riverkeeper. They were going to go out and track down and prosecute every polluter on the Hudson. 18 months later, they collected the first bounty in United States history under this 19th century statute. They shut down the Penn Central pipe for good. They got to keep $2,000, which was a huge amount of money in Crotonville, New York in 1968. There were 2 weeks of wild celebration in the town, and they used the money that was left over to go after Ciba-Geigy and Tuck Tape and Standard Brands and American Cyanamid, the biggest corporations in America, and winning these lawsuits. In 1973, they collected the highest penalty in United States history against a corporate polluter. They got $200,000 from Anaconda Wire and Cable for dumping toxics at Hastings, New York. They used that money to construct a boat, which they began patrolling the river, tracking down polluters. In 1983, they used bounty money to hire their first full-time riverkeeper, a former commercial fisherman named John Cronin. He hired me using bounty money a year later to be the prosecuting attorney for the group. And I had always known that I wanted to work on the environment from when I was a little boy. In fact, when I was 8 years old, I wrote an article, a letter to my uncle who was then in the White House, telling him that I wanted to have a meeting with him about pollution. And he brought me in. He brought me in and had me at the Oval Office, and I still have pictures of myself in my shorty shorts and my little Our Lady of Victory handkerchief, and I brought him a salamander in a vase, which we had just gotten chlorinated water, and it had died. And so, but I was in denial about that. And we spent a lot of the meeting talking about the health of the salamander. And then he'd say, "It doesn't look well to me." And and then we went and released it in the Rose Garden Fountain. But I had worked as a district attorney in Manhattan. I knew that I wanted to work the environment, and I began working with the fishermen in 1984. I had not taken an environmental course when I was at law school because there was only one offered. It was basically it was a nascent discipline at that time in 1981. I went back to night school at Pace Law School in White Plains, New York, which is in the Hudson Valley, and was a new law school that was specializing in environmental law, and I got a master's degree. And then they asked me to stay, so that I went to night school so I could be a better advocate for my clients. They asked me to stay on and run an environmental litigation clinic, and I said I'd do it if the Waterkeeper were the client, the only client. We did that, so for 30 years I've run this clinic. Now I have 2 partners. I have 10 students who are permitted to practice law under my supervision as if they're attorneys. We give each of the students 4 polluters to sue at the beginning of the semester. They file complaints, they do discovery, they go do depositions, they go to court, they argue their case, they can do anything an attorney can do. If they don't win the case, they don't pass the course. And we've brought, I'm just kidding about that, but we've brought, since we started the clinic, over 500 successful legal actions against Hudson River polluters. We force polluters, thank you. We force polluters to spend over $5.5 billion remediating the Hudson. And today, largely as a result of our work, the Hudson River is an international model for ecosystem protection. This is a waterway that was a national joke in 1966. It was, at that time, dead water, zero dissolved oxygen for 20-mile stretches north of New York City, south of Albany. It caught fire. It turned colors depending on what color they were painting the trucks at the GM plant in Tarrytown. It was a national joke. Today, it is the richest waterway in the North Atlantic. It produces more pounds of fish per acre, more biomass per gallon than any other waterway in the Atlantic Ocean north of the equator. It's the last major river system left in the Atlantic Ocean, and I'll throw in the Mediterranean and the Aegean and the Adriatic and the Black Sea and the Baltic and the Marmara and the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. All of the rivers that flow into those waterways, there's only one left that still has strong spawning stocks of all of its historical species of migratory fish, and that's the Hudson. It's Noah's Ark, it's a species warehouse, it's the last refuge for many of these animals that are going extinct elsewhere. And the miraculous resurrection of the Hudson inspired the creation of river keepers now on waterways all over the world. We own the keeper name. We license these new groups to get started. They have to comply with licensing standards. They have to have a boat. They have to have a full-time paid waterkeeper, and they have to be willing to do litigation against polluters. We do law enforcement. We have very, very good environmental laws in this country, and interestingly, most of the countries in the world have guaranteed rights to a clean environment. The problem is they're seldom enforced, and that is a failure of democracy, because the Constitution and the law guarantee us this right, but the polluters are able to subvert democracy to make sure that we don't get the benefits of those laws and those rights. But when we passed the environmental laws, beginning in 1970 after Earth Day, we included the 28 environmental laws. We included in each one, almost all of them, a provision because we knew this was going to happen. We knew the regulatory agencies and the enforcement agencies were going to become captured by the industries they're supposed to regulate. So in each one of those laws, we inserted a provision that was modeled on the provision of the 1888 Rivers and Harbors Act. It's called a citizen suit provision. It says if somebody's breaking the law, the government fails to enforce it, that any citizen who's affected by that pollution can step into the shoes of the United States Attorney and prosecute that polluter for penalties of usually $31,000 a day and for injunctive relief, and we can get our attorney's fees back if we win the lawsuit. So it's a very, very powerful statute, and all of these keepers in this country operate, and fund themselves, at least partially, by bringing those kind of enforcement lawsuits when the government fails to act, which they almost always do. There's a couple of kind of unifying themes that that are part of this movement, part of the Waterkeeper movement. And you have to remember, this movement came out of people who were in the water, who were working. These were not look but don't touch environmentalists. They were people who were in the water. They were exploiting it as a resource. They were doing it sustainably. And one of the kind of the themes of the movement is this idea that we're not protecting the environment so much for the sake of the fishes and the birds. We're protecting it for our own sake, because we recognize that nature is the infrastructure of our communities, and that if we want to meet our obligation as a generation, as a nation, as a civilization, which is to create communities for our children that provide them with the same opportunities for dignity and enrichment and prosperity and good health as the communities that our parents gave us, we've got to start by protecting our environmental infrastructure, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the wildlife, the fisheries, the public lands, those things, those assets that cannot be reduced to private property ownership, but by their nature are the property, the assets of the whole community, what we call the commons or the commonwealth, or historically the public trust asset. And this is, those include public lands and rivers and beaches and the landscapes that connect us to our past, to our history, that provide context to our communities, and that are the source ultimately of our values and our virtues and our character as a people. And the law says that those things belong to us. They don't belong to the polluters. General Electric Company now owns every fish in the Hudson River because it polluted the Hudson, so we can't use the fish anymore. The fishermen, the 1,000 fishing families that I represented at the beginning of my career, there is only 2 left now on the river. They've been put out of business. And this was a social safety net. During the Great Depression, tens of thousands of men who were jobless went down to the Hudson and found jobs there in the commercial fishery or found sustainable fishing to feed their families. Today, if there were a Great Depression, that social safety net is gone. And it was much more resilient than the Social Security system. It had been there for a million years, or at least 20,000 years since the Pleistocene Ice Age. And yet, General Electric stole it. It privatized the commons. And the law in the state of Texas says that the waterways in the state are owned by the people of the state. They're not owned by the big polluters or agribusiness or the oil industry or the gas industry. They're owned by the people. Everybody has a right to use them. Nobody has a right to use them in a way that will diminish or injure their use and enjoyment by others. This is ancient law. It goes back to Roman times. It's in the Code of Justinian, which was the first effort at constitutional government. And the Code of Justinian said that if you're a Roman citizen, that you have a right, you have ownership of the commons, and it enumerates the commons as air, water, wildlife, fisheries, public lands, aquifers, and shorelands, fisheries, and forests, certain forests. And they had something that was like, not like a park, but like a protected public forest in ancient Rome. One of the lessons I've seen again and again and again, and you see historically as well, is that as constitutional government and democracy decline and diminish, and tyranny moves in, one of the first acts of every tyranny include efforts by powerful private entities to privatize the public trust. So when Roman law broke down in Europe during the Dark Ages, 800 years of famine and tyranny, etc., and ignorance and darkness, in every jurisdiction in Europe, you had, and this is a little bit of a digression, but this whole talk has turned into a digression. But you had, it's a little history lesson. You had, in every jurisdiction in Europe, you had local kings and feudal lords selling off or privatizing public trust assets. For example, in England, King John said that the deer and the game animals, like the rabbits and hares and these kind of animals, no longer belong to the public. that they now belonged only to the nobility and only the nobility could hunt them. And this, again, was an attack on the social safety net, because if you lost your job, the crops didn't come in, you could always go into the forest and kill a deer and feed your family. This is what got King John in trouble with Robin Hood. At the same time, he erected navigational tolls on the Thames and the rivers of England. So again, what was once free and a social safety net that you could go up and down the river to sell goods, to visit people, to recreate or whatever, now you had to pay somebody for the privilege of doing that. He also sold monopolies to his friends to all the fisheries of England. So again, if you lost your job, you could catch a fish. Now you had to pay somebody for that privilege. These assaults on fundamental rights and what essentially was the germination seeds of democracy so enraged the public that they rose up, led by the barons, and confronted King John in the Battle of Runnymede, and they forced him to sign the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta is the birthplace, the Bethlehem of all of our Bill of Rights in the U.S. Constitution, including ones we don't have anymore, like habeas corpus. But all of those, 1,000-year-old rights that we have. But it also has chapters on free access to fisheries, to navigable waters, and this was the law of England. These aren't new laws that we created. In the 16th century, there was a Clean Air Act in London that made it a capital crime to burn coal in a stove in London, and people were executed for it. So, a lot of times I'll sit across a negotiating table from a polluter who I've sued, and they'll be saying, well, we didn't know it was wrong to fill the wetland or to pollute the river because these are new laws that, hippies invented on Earth Day. But they're not. These laws always existed. It's always been wrong to pollute. It's always been illegal to pollute. And we had after the Magna Carta, when we had the revolution in our country, those rights descended to the people of the states, and they're embedded in the Constitution of the various states. And in fact, the law in this country, a lot of times the polluters talk about property rights. We have a property right to pollute. What they're really talking about is using their property in a way to steal your property, because that's what pollution does. So in this country, until 1847, the law in every jurisdiction was that if you had a factory and smoke from your factory got onto my property as little as 1 day a year, that I had a right to shut down your factory. And in fact, the judge had no choice but to do so, because there was no such thing as liquidated damages then. You couldn't, pay me the diminished value of my land. You had to end the nuisance. So, and that was the law. And those laws, through corruption and through an honest urge to make way for the burgeoning industrial revolution in America, those laws were eroded. But by 1960s, we were beginning to feel the pendulum swing so far to the other side. And the person who alerted us to that was Rachel Carson, who wrote her book, The Silent Spring, which told people there's a cost to these pesticides. It's not just going to give us an agricultural revolution. There's a cost in health and diminishment of our lives, the diminishment of our quality, the impoverishment of the environment. And I remember what it was like before Earth Day. I remember the Cuyahoga River burning in 1969 with flames that were 8 stories high and took a week to put out. I remember the same year Lake Erie being declared dead. Same year the oil spill in Southern California closed every beach in Southern California, cost those communities billions of dollars. I remember what the air was like when I grew up in Washington, D.C., with the soot landing on the cars and making your shirt filthy and killing thousands of people every year from bad air events. I remember in 1963, when the Adams peregrine, the eastern Adams, most spectacular predatory bird in North America, went extinct, the same year that my uncle was killed. In 1970, That accumulation of insults drove 20 million Americans out onto the street, 10% of our population, the largest public demonstration in American history, demanding that our political leaders return to the American people the ancient environmental rights that had been stolen from our citizens over the previous 80 years. And the political system, frightened by this enormous outpouring of democratic power. Republicans and Democrats got together. Nixon was president. He created EPA, signed the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. Over the next 10 years, we passed 28 environmental statutes that protect our air, water, wildlife, fisheries, public lands. And these weren't new laws. They were simply the reenactment and the codification of the ancient laws of trespass and nuisance and the public commons, the public trust doctrine. And all of those laws were simply reenacted in federal statutes and in many cases in state statutes as well. But one of the things that I recognized during my 30 years of defending these laws and trying to enforce them is that wherever you see large-scale environmental injury, you'll also see the subversion of democracy. You'll see the corruption of public officials. You'll see the capture of the agencies that are supposed to protect Americans from pollution. Those agencies become sign. You see it right here in Texas. They become sock puppets for the industries that they're supposed to regulate. You see the disappearance of transparency in government. You see the disappearance, you see the corruption of the press, or the compromise of the press. And also, you see the end or the diminishment of local control. And, I'll give you an example of this. In the town where I live in Bedford, New York, somebody tried to build a quarry in our town, and we passed a zoning law and said you can't do that because it's going to diminish everybody else's property values. So yeah, you're going to make that one guy rich, but all the rest of us are going to pay for it. And that law was upheld by the Supreme Court, by the top appellate court in New York State. In coal country in Kentucky and West Virginia, where I do a lot of my work, they don't have those laws. Those laws have been abolished constitutionally so that there is no way for localities to object to mountaintop removal mining. In North Carolina, the laws have been abolished that would allow localities to object to factory farms in their backyard. And the agencies in those states are really just mouthpieces for the industries that they're supposed to regulate. In North Carolina, one of the first river keepers after the Hudson River Keeper was the Neuse River Keeper, Rick Dove, who was a 27-year veteran of the United States Marine Corps. He was a judge advocate general in the Marine, lifelong Republican, and the owner of a commercial fishing operation on the Neuse River, which was his dream job after he retired from the Marines. That was his lifetime plan. 2 years after he started that restaurant and fishing business, 1 billion fish died in the Neuse River with pustulating lesions on their bodies, and nobody could explain why. And Rick traced the pollution to the hog industry, which had happened below anybody's radar. Why? Because the hog factories were placed in poor communities that had no voice, no bullhorn, no papers, no access to public office. What had happened in North Carolina is a state legislature named Wendell Murphy, a state senator, had looked at what had happened to the chicken industry in this country over the previous 15 years. This was in 1984. And he had seen how 3 men, Don Tyson, Bo Pilgrim, and Frank Perdue, had put 1 million independent chicken farmers out of business and changed the chicken industry from an agricultural industry to an industrial one. They would shoehorn up to 1 million birds into a single facility and keep them in tiny battery cages where they literally could not turn around or spread their wings. and then dose them with drugs and hormones and manipulate them with light to cause them to literally lay their guts out over a short and miserable life. They made themselves billionaires, and they put every independent fryer, broiler, and egg producer in America effectively out of business. And Wendell Murphy said, I couldn't do that with hogs. And he passed 28 laws quickly in 2 years in North Carolina that made it almost impossible for anybody to sue somebody who calls themselves a hog farmer, even if it has nothing to do with farming, and to give giant subsidies to this new industry. And at that time, there were 28,000 independent hog farmers in the state, raising hogs sustainably, providing jobs and enrichment for community, particularly for smaller farmers. Within 10 years, they had dropped the price Wendell Murphy dropped the price from 60 cents a pound to 2 cents a pound. And it cost farmers 32 cents a pound to raise the hog to kill weight. He put out of business every hog farmer in the state except those that would sign a contract with him, and that contract is dooms that farmer to involuntary servitude. So in 10 years, they went from 28,000 hog farmers to 2,200 factories, and those factories were deliberately put in areas of the state where it was minorities, it was black, Hispanic, and where people wouldn't complain. And we see this, that polluters always choose the soft targets of poverty. 4 out of every 5 toxic waste dumps in this country is in a black neighborhood. The largest toxic waste dump in America is at Mobile, Alabama, where a third of the population is under poverty and 65% are black. The highest concentration of toxic waste dumps in America is at south side of Chicago. The most contaminated zip code in California is East LA. Navajo youth have 1,000 times the rate of sexual organ cancer as other Americans because of the thousands of tons of toxic uranium tailings that have been dumped on their reservation lands. And this is where, in North Carolina, again, we've sued the Riverkeepers. We now have 14 Riverkeepers in North Carolina. We have an Air Force that flies over the state every day filming these industries because you can't photograph them from the road. So we have a volunteer Air Force with 10 airplanes that Rick Dove, with his Marine, he has everybody in uniforms, and we patrol that state, and we now not only are bringing the hog industry under control, but also one of the worst, probably the worst toxic polluter in the state, one of the worst in the country, which is coal ash from utilities. There's now 1,400 uncontrolled, unlined coal ash pits with leaching hideously at every coal burning power plant in the country, leaching these hideously toxic witch's brew of poisons into local waterways. And again, they're almost always located in impoverished neighborhoods. Oh, and this is one of the corollaries of this idea that the best measure of how a democracy functions is how it distributes the goods of the land. Does it keep them in the hands of the public? Whether you're black or white, rich or poor, humble or noble, every person in the state of North Carolina, every kid, every child should be able to go down to the Neuse River and pull in a fish and bring it home and feed it to their family with the security that they're not poisoning somebody. And we have that right. The Constitution guarantees it. But those rights have been stolen from our people. And one of the other things, I make 2 more points. One of the other ones is that, again, and this came out of this movement, which was a movement started by capitalists, by people who believed, were idealistic about the American system and idealistic about own your own business and hard work and believed in those things, and who had an extraordinary industry that had functioned for 350 years. And you'll hear a lot of times now from the big polluters, from the Koch brothers, and from their indentured servants in Washington, D.C. and the state capitals, and their toadies on Fox News, you'll hear that, well, we have to choose between economic prosperity on the one hand and environmental protection on the other. And that is a false choice. In 100% of the situations, good environmental policy is identical to good economic policy. If we want to measure our economy, and this is how we ought to be measuring it, based upon how it produces jobs and the dignity of jobs over the generations, over the long term, and how it preserves the value of the assets of our community. If, on the other hand, we want to do what the Koch brothers and the big polluters want us to do, which is to treat our country as if it were a business in liquidation, convert our natural resources to cash as quickly as possible, have a few years of pollution-based prosperity, we can generate an instantaneous cash flow and the illusion of a prosperous economy, and we can make a few people billionaires by impoverishing the rest of us. But our children are going to pay for our joyride, and they're going to pay for it with denuded landscapes and poor health and huge cleanup costs that are going to amplify and metastasize over time, and that they will never be able to pay. Environmental injury is deficit spending. It's a way of loading the costs of our generation's prosperity onto the backs of our children. And one of the things that I've done over the past 3 decades as an environmental advocate is to constantly go around and confront this argument that an investment in our environment is a diminishment of our nation's wealth. It doesn't diminish our wealth. It's an investment in infrastructure. The same as investing in telecommunications or road construction. It's an investment we have to make if we're going to ensure the economic vitality of our generation and future generations. Last point was this, and then I'll shut up. People have asked me for 30 years, because of my background with the fishermen, I've always answered this question when people ask me for the last 30 years, what's the most important environmental law that you would pass if you could pass any law? I've always said the same thing. I'd have true free market capitalism. And now I'd say something different, which is I would get rid of Citizens United. Because for capitalism to work, you need democracy to work. And right now, we don't have a democracy. We have what I would call a corporate kleptocracy. We have, an oligarchy by the corporation, by the wealthy. And you can't have a clean environment or safe or wholesome environment when you have that. And I'll give you an example. The fishermen on the Hudson, they had a business plan that worked. Their capitalist system was working for 3.5 centuries. They wanted their children to be able to do the same thing. And it didn't stop working because of a failure of their business model. It stopped working because of a failure of capitalism, a failure of democracy, because the General Electric Company had better lobbyists in Albany, and those lobbyists were able to persuade the governor to waive the law that made it illegal for General Electric to dump their PCBs into the Hudson, to waive enforcement of the law. The law was still there. It was illegal what they were doing. But the governor said, we won't enforce it. We'll let you dump it. And they dumped their PCBs in, and all the fisheries were closed. And these men and women were put out of work. And they knew that there was nothing they had done wrong. They were working. They were sustainably. This was a sustainable fishery from when the Algonquins were running it, from when the Dutch were running it. They would count the fish every year, and as they came up the river, the shad, the sturgeon, the herring, the alewives. We had a huge caviar fishery in the Hudson. We have 11-foot sturgeon, 200 pounds of caviar in them. There's a very rich fishery, and blue crabs, and all of these animals coming up the river. They would count them every year. And then they would say, if there were not enough of them, they would say to all the fishermen, lift your net 1 day a week, 2 days a week, and all the nets would be lifted out of the Hudson to let the fish run up the river. And that way they managed the river for generations, for hundreds and hundreds of years. But it wasn't their fault that the fishery collapsed. It was the General Electric Company's subversion of democracy. So, and as long as we have citizens united, the polluters are going to be in charge of our country, and that's going to happen to every time that we try to do something sustainable for our children or idealistic for our children. We're going to be commoditized. Our assets are going to be liquidated and turned into profit by the big shots who own our government. And that's just, so we need to get rid of Citizens United or nothing else works. But coming back to capitalism, the reason I believe that true free market capitalism is the best thing for the environment is because in a true marketplace, in a rational marketplace, a rational marketplace promotes efficiency. And efficiency means the elimination of waste. And pollution is waste. And a rational marketplace would require us to properly value our natural resources, the commons. And it's the undervaluation of those resources that causes us to use them wastefully. In a true free market capitalism, you can't make yourself rich without making your neighbors rich and without enriching your community. Well, what polluters do is they make themselves rich by making everybody else poor. They raise standards of living for themselves by lowering quality of life for everybody else. And they do that by escaping the discipline of the free market. You show me a polluter, and I will show you a subsidy. I will show you a fat cat using political clout to escape the discipline of the free market and force the public to pay his production costs. That's what all pollution is. You know, and the Koch brothers claim that they love, should I stand down? Okay, yeah. Anyway, I'll shut up, but I'll finish by saying this, that what all of the environmental laws, the 28 laws that we passed after Earth Day 1970, all of those laws were intended to restore free market capitalism in this country by forcing actors in the marketplace to pay the true cost of bringing their product to market. And what we do as Waterkeepers, we don't even consider ourselves environmentalists anymore. We're free marketeers. We go out into the marketplace and we catch the cheaters, the polluters, and we say to them, we're going to force you to internalize your costs the same way that you internalize your profits. Because as long as somebody is cheating the free market, none of us gets the advantages of the efficiency, the prosperity, and the democracy that free market capitalism otherwise promises our nation. What we have to understand as Americans is there's a huge difference between free market capitalism, which makes a nation more efficient, more prosperous, and more democratic, and the kind of corporate crony capitalism, which we've now embraced in this country, which is as antithetical to efficiency, democracy, and prosperity in America as it is in Nigeria. So I will now shut up and take some questions. Thank you.